The early morning light filled the hospital room, softly enveloping the three women standing guard at the man's bedside. He lay silent, his once muscular body now gaunt with pain, ravaged from the inside by cancer. A petite brunette in her mid-40s pressed the man's hand to her cheek. Her curly, shoulder-length hair hid her beautiful, tear-stained face. Next to her sat her counterpart, a woman in her mid-20s. On the other side of the bed sat a 30-year-old, tall, attractive blonde woman with the same facial features as the man in the bed. She was lovingly wiping her father's now bald head. Their silent vigil was interrupted by a quiet knock at the door. A tall, blonde-haired man poked his head inside. "Sis, is he awake?" he asked the blonde in a whisper. "Not now, Tim," Angie answered. "He's only awake for a short time. The morphine keeps putting him to sleep." "Molly," he said softly, turning to the older brunette. "Can we come in?" She looked up at him, smiled weakly, and nodded. He stepped back and opened the door. A very attractive woman in her 50s walked into the room, embarrassed. Her long hair, consisting of a thick mixture of blonde and silver strands, flowed freely over her shoulders. Even at her age, she still had a body that women 20 years younger would envy. "Molly," she greeted softly. "Gwen, please come in." Angie stood up and looked at Molly. Molly smiled encouragingly and nodded. The young blonde turned to her guest again. "I think you can sit here, Mom." "Thank you, Angie." To what followed was a chess game between humans. Each move of one of the human chess pieces caused another piece to move. Each move to the king triggered a counter-move to defend it. Finally, there was silence in the room. Gwen now sat on the other side of the bed from Molly and her daughter Jessica. Angie had moved to a chair in one corner, and Tim was sitting on a chair in the other corner. "Thank you for letting me come today," Gwen said quietly. "When the kids told me that Joe was going to spend the rest of his time at home, I had to ask to see him." "It was the right thing to do," Molly said tiredly. "I discussed it with Joe, and he agreed. He won't need visitors once we get him home today, so I'm glad you could be here before he's discharged." He groaned softly as his eyes slowly opened. Eyes that hadn't looked at each other in over a decade now met. "Gwen?" he whispered softly. "I'm here, Joe," she whispered. "Where's Molly?" "I'm here, honey," his wife said softly, stroking his arm. He smiled weakly, looking into his wife's soft brown eyes. Looking around the room, he turned his attention to everyone present. "We are gathered here today," he grinned, hearing a few chuckles. Opening his eyes, he took a deep breath. He cleared his throat and stared at his ex-wife. "Okay, Gwen," he said weakly. "Say what you need to say. I'm sorry if I doze off. I can't stay awake." "I understand, Joe," Gwen said. "I'll be brief, but if you do fall asleep, please don't worry. Most of what I have to say is about our children anyway." He nodded, and she took a deep breath. "Joe, I just wanted to say goodbye to you. It's already been said. 10 years ago." "Yes," she said with a slight tremor in her voice. "I remember. But when I heard you were dying, I realized there was something else I needed to tell you." "I'm sorry," she whispered tensely. "Please, Joe, tell me you forgive me." They stared at each other in silence for a moment before Joe sighed. "You're forgiven," he said softly. Gwen leaned back, clearly surprised by his answer. "Just like that?" she asked. He snorted. "No, not just like that. It took years to say it and mean it. Molly was the key." He wrinkled his nose in pain and let out a muffled groan. Reaching out, he pressed the button on the morphine drip. After a few seconds, his breathing became deeper and his face visibly relaxed. A few minutes later, he was asleep. "I'm sorry, Gwen," Molly said softly. "He's going to be away for a while. I know it's probably not what you were hoping for." Gwen shook her head. "Actually, it was more than I could have hoped for. I could only dream that he would say he forgave me. I know I have you to thank for that." "No," Molly said softly, shaking her head. "I could never get Joe to do anything he didn't really want to do. Oh, I know he'd do things for me that he'd rather not do, but he'd never do anything he didn't think was right. Hi, I'm still grateful to him for finding someone like you after I lost his love." You didn't lose his love, Mom, Angie hissed. You threw it away. I know, Angie, Gwen replied sadly, and it's something I'll regret for the rest of my life. You regret it too, don't you? Angie snorted, and then sat silent, her lips pressed together as if she'd eaten a lemon. My soul, we all regret things we wish we hadn't done or things we hoped might have turned out differently. Some of it we couldn't control, and some of it we brought on ourselves. My biggest regret is that I let myself go crazy in those months. Don't try to make excuses, Angie snapped. No, I didn't say I wasn't responsible for my actions, just that my thinking was very distorted at the time. There was a lot going on back then. I doubt you or Tim were aware of it. I know that neither your father nor I ever told you the details of everything that happened. Joe chose not to because he thought I had betrayed him, not you two, since you were both gone. I never told you about it because, because it would make you hate me even more than you already do. I don't hate you, Mom, Angie said coldly. I hate what you did, not you. But I will never sit still and listen to someone minimize the devastation and pain your betrayal has caused. Angie, Tim, please believe me when I say that I never thought about how much pain my actions would cause. How could you not, Mom? Tim said calmly from his seat. You must have known that cheating on your father would hurt him. You and our family were his whole world. Gwen nodded. You're right. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I ignored the consequences. When I let myself think about it, I realized at once how much danger I was putting my marriage in. Unfortunately, that realization only came when I was already involved in an affair. By then, it was too late. During the divorce, everyone asked me why I had done such a terrible thing. I wish I had a better explanation than the pathetic excuses I made at the time. I've had 10 years to analyze my actions, and I think I now have a better idea of what happened. It's not an excuse, she said, looking coldly at her daughter. It's just an explanation of how it happened. Until now, I've been reluctant to admit the reasons because they made me look as selfish and superficial as I was. Simply put, several things had happened at the same time that had given me the opportunity to change Joe, and I had arrogantly and foolishly gone along with it. Gwen, Molly said softly, you are a very beautiful woman. I'm sure that in all the years of your marriage, you've had many opportunities to break your marriage vows. Gwen smiled weakly at her ex-husband's wife. Thank you, and you're right. I've had many opportunities, but not like this. Joe started traveling again after he got a big contract. I knew he'd taken it to help pay for Angie and Tim's college. We discussed it and were in agreement. It was only for 6 months, but it affected me worse than I could have imagined. When he traveled early in our marriage, I had the kids to help me cope. Now that they were both in college, I was alone. I felt so old and alone. Then at work, I started being stalked by a young, handsome man. I realized Douglas was only doing it for sex, but when you get attention from a handsome, rising corporate star, it's very flattering. Angie snorted as a pained look of disappointment appeared on Tim's face. Gwen quickly continued. As I said, she said quietly as she looked at her children, I've been arrogant and selfish. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I hope you can understand how I let it happen. I want you to know that there was never anything in this that your father did or didn't do. It was my fears and then my ego that opened the door. I never stopped loving him, even during the affair. How can you say that, Mom? Angie grinned. You slept with another man. I know you don't believe it, but it's true. The problem wasn't that I didn't love your father. I did. The problem was that I loved myself more. During this time, I was putting my needs and wants above the needs of my family and your father. For 4 months, I used my feelings of unhappiness to justify betraying my marital vows. When I finally came to my senses, I cut the affair short. But the seeds of destruction had already been sown. I hoped I could come to terms with it and spare your father the pain of finding out his wife was a cheating whore. I knew there was a good chance he would divorce me if he found out. Then why did you have to tell him, Mom? Tim said sadly. Was it just to ease your guilt? Angie intervened. No, honey, that wasn't the only reason. Yes, my guilt was eating me alive. I knew your father could see that things had changed after that contract. That year after my affair, things were so tense between us at times. I realized that sooner or later I would have to confess to him. However, fate stepped in and did it sooner than I had hoped. When I broke off my affair with Douglas, I knew that neither of us wanted it to be known. In fact, he had more to lose than I did. He was married to the daughter of one of our board members and was the star project manager of our corporation. He was about to become the youngest vice president of our corporation. So when I ended the affair, I set one condition. He was never to have any contact with Joe or work with him on any project. In the past, my corporation had contracted with your father's company on numerous occasions, and I couldn't bear the thought of Joe reporting to Douglas. Douglas would always have the secret knowledge that he had slept with me, and he may have influenced your father in some way. I couldn't have him disrespecting Joe. Sounds silly, doesn't it? After all these months of me disrespecting your father? Douglas, of course, agreed. It seemed like everything would be all right if I could get over the guilt. And then that bloody government contract came along. It was potentially worth millions, and I knew that Douglas would take the lead on any GSA project if we won it. I also knew that Joe's company would be deeply involved in the project. After we won the bid, my fears were realized. It was announced that Joe would lead the engineering team, which is an integral part of the project. Of course, he would report to the project manager, Douglas. I met with Douglas and reminded him of our agreement, but he told me that business is business and refused to step aside. I guess he didn't believe I would follow through on my threat. He was wrong. Gwen paused and took a deep breath. The tears streaming down her face testified to the pain the memories were causing. Your father handled my confession as I expected. He sat stoically and listened, asking a few clarifying questions. I watched him gather the necessary information before making a decision. When I saw a tear running down his cheek, I knew it was going to end badly for us. The next day, he removed himself from the team. I don't know if he was trying to do the right thing and protect his company's interests, or if he suspected what would happen when he left. Either way, things worked out just fine for your father as all hell broke loose. He was a key figure on that team, so when he tried to leave, it got everyone's attention, including the bigwigs in both of our companies. When they started asking questions, their assistants started digging for answers. It didn't take them long to uncover the affair between Douglas and me. And that's when the nightmares that had plagued me for the past year became a reality. As I expected, the dollar sign outweighed all of Douglas's influence, and he was removed from the project. This, however, went in favor of Joe and his company. The awkwardness of the situation prompted my corporation's management to offer his company a larger percentage of the contract profits, and he ended up getting a promotion. Things weren't going so well for Douglas and me. "What did you expect?" Tim commented coldly. "I didn't expect it, dearie," Gwen said softly. "Not even then." The embarrassment of her confession was etched on her normally pretty face. It was obvious that she had been carrying this burden for years. I couldn't even imagine how bad it would be. Douglas and I tried to find another job, but found that we were actually on the blacklist. Apparently, Douglas's father-in-law took his family and daughter's shame very personally. As a result, Douglas was sent to all sorts of unpleasant projects in the most disadvantaged third-world countries. After spending several years bouncing from one armpit of the world to another, he finally gave up. He gave his wife a divorce and crawled away with nothing. Last I heard, he was selling insurance in Detroit. Since he was a couple rungs above me in the corporation, he was still considered one of my bosses. I know the company feared a lawsuit, so they promoted me. I was transferred back to some office that will never see the light of day. I guess I shouldn't complain, the money is decent, but my career is basically over. She paused and looked into the eyes of everyone in the room as if trying to gauge how they took her confession. Jessica squinted. She hated to hear her stepfather betrayed. Molly looked worried and wary. It was clear she already knew most of this. Just the looks from Tim and Angie made her flinch. The hurt and disappointment in their eyes seemed to be beyond her. Slowly, she pulled herself together and continued. If I thought things were bad at work, what was happening at home was pure hell. My marriage was crumbling, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Joe sat down and talked to me several times after he filed for divorce. I apologized until I was blue in the face. I told him that none of this was his fault, that I was the one who ruined our wonderful marriage. He said he couldn't be too wonderful if he wasn't wonderful enough to keep me out of Douglas's bed. That was painful. I understood why he was bitter and why he said it, but it still hurt. Joe asked me why I had cheated. My answer was just a string of excuses. After that, he stopped all communication with me. At first, I was angry and upset. I was angry at myself for bringing all this down on us, and I was disappointed at Joe for not trying to help save the marriage. "Oh, please, Mom," Angie growled. "If Dad had cheated on you, would you forgive him and fight for the marriage?" Gwen shook her head slowly and smiled sadly. "We both know the answer to that question, Dove. I would have been far more vindictive and would have tried to hurt him far more than your father did." "Angie, I said I was disappointed, but not because I didn't understand why he was reacting that way. I didn't really blame him. I was angry because I saw our 20-year marriage going downhill. I knew I had pulled the plug, but I was furious that I couldn't stop it. Only Joe had the chance to save it, and he chose not to. You know, if he really wanted to make my life hell, he would have taken me back." There were a few sighs. "You always had a way with words, didn't you, Mom?" Angie grinned. "That's not what I meant, and you know it, Angie," she said, with tears in her eyes. "What do you mean, Mom?" Tim asked softly, standing behind her back. "I would do anything to show your father how sorry I am for ruining us. I would have humiliated myself to the point of shaming the old Tijuana whore just so he could find a way to love me again." But that night, when I told him about my cheating, I knew it would never happen. Even through my tears, I saw how deeply I had hurt the man I claimed to love. I swear I saw his love for me die right before my eyes. Our marriage was over. I saw it in his eyes. "He had to move on, Mom," Tim said softly. "We all did." "Yes, I know. I also know that I still have some struggles. You kids have helped me a lot with that. Oh, I know that at first you were angry with me. No, more like furious. You had every right to be, but you didn't abandon me. I'm not sure I could have survived that. I'm grateful Joe didn't turn you against me." "Dad would never do that," Tim said quietly. "No," Gwen said, shaking her head. "No, it wouldn't have been him." She smiled sadly at her son and then turned to Molly. "Do you know that I prayed that somehow I could get my marriage back? I have prayed and begged God to somehow change Joe's heart and mind and give me another chance. I know I didn't deserve it, but I wanted it. I clung to that dream for over a year. Then Angie told me that he started seriously dating you, Molly. That's when I realized my prayers weren't going to be answered. It wasn't until you and Joe got married that I seriously tried to get my life together. I started dating again, and that's when I found out what my marriage was like before I ruined it. We had something really good, but I had forgotten how special it was. But I was reminded of it when I started dating again. Gosh, how I was reminded. I dated quite a lot, but it always led to me starting to compare them to Joe, and after that it didn't last long. There is a special intimacy between lovers that only comes with time. Only someone who has already made love to you many times knows when you want to be taken by force, with unbridled passion, and when just gentle caresses and a soft kiss will take you to the limit. You can't imagine how humiliating it is to realize that just because you want your lover to know these things, it's not going to happen. Not because he doesn't want to, but because he doesn't know you and your body well enough to understand what brings you the most satisfaction in the moment. My nightmare was realizing that I was the reason these things were gone. Because of my actions, every romantic relationship I now had to start from scratch. Oh, there were a few relationships that seemed promising over the years. 2 of them even ended up with proposals, but I turned them both down. "Why?" Molly asked, with concern on her face. "Why didn't I say yes?" Gwen took a deep breath. "Well, it's a bit complicated. One of the reasons was that I still loved my ex-husband." "Mom!" Angie grumbled. "No!" Gwen snapped back. "You can't tell me what I already know. You can't tell me anything I haven't heard and told myself a million times. None of you can tell me how I feel. I love your father, and I always will. I know it won't change anything, but I will always feel guilty for what I did. I'm learning to live with those feelings and move on. In some ways I've succeeded, but I'm still stuck in other areas." "Angie, honey," Molly said softly, trying to calm the situation down. "It's okay. I'm not jealous. I know how much your daddy loves me." Gwen flinched slightly. I know that too, Molly, Gwen continued, calming herself down. That's why I felt I could make such a statement. I know that you will have his love forever. I admit to being jealous of it, but it was my own doing. Please, I don't want anyone to think that my feelings for Joe were the reason I turned down those marriage proposals. It's much deeper than that. Like everyone else here, I have wondered, if I really loved my husband as I said I did, how could I have betrayed him like that? I wished I had an answer I could live with. So I compared my love for potential suitors to my love for Joe. And since my feelings for each of them were not as strong as they were for him, I had a problem. If I couldn't be faithful to Joe, how could I pledge allegiance to any of them? I cared enough about them to say no to each of them. It was the right thing to do at the time, as it wouldn't have been fair to them. I'm sorry, Molly said softly. I'm sorry you're going through this. Gwen smiled sadly. It's easy to see why Joe fell in love with you, Molly, she said sadly. You're beautiful both inside and out. Thank you, but please, Molly said anxiously. Don't make me out to be some kind of saint. I have my regrets, Gwen. Most of them relate to my first marriage, but one in particular has to do with Joe. Mom? Asked a worried Jessica. No, it wasn't something terrible, but I'm ashamed of it. Since Gwen is so brave to talk about her regrets, I'll try to follow her example. It was a few months after Joe and I started dating. Our dates were pretty hot and heavy, but we didn't, we weren't. Molly paused, her face contorted as she tried to find the right words. Having sex? Jessica said, smiling. You mean bumping uglies? Angie added, snickering. Hiding a sausage! Fooling around! Girls! Molly argued. Knock boots! Jessica howled. Punching! Making babies! Girls! Molly bellowed, her face turning bright red. Tim laughed with the girls, and Gwen quietly tried to hide her expression of pain. I wanted to tell you, Molly said, trying to regain her composure, that Joe and I haven't been intimate yet. I knew that for him, and for both of us, it had been a long time coming, and the sexual tension between us made things difficult. And then I overheard the phone ringing. It was obvious that Molly was starting to feel uncomfortable. Taking a deep breath, she continued. I heard Joe talking to someone. At first I thought it was you, Angie, but now I realize I don't know who it was. But whoever it was, Joe was talking about a possible reconciliation with Gwen. I knew I loved Joe, but I was still very scared after the disaster of my first marriage. Even though my first husband had left us 9 years ago, I had never let a man as close to me as Joe. I knew he was a good man, that he would be a good father and a wonderful husband. So I decided he was mine. That week I shamelessly pounced on him, trying to possess him and keep his attention on me alone. In short, I seduced him. Mom, Jessica said, smiling. I highly doubt it took much seduction to get Dad's attention. I mean, gosh darn it, every time I saw you two, you were constantly touching each other. Seriously, Molly, Angie added, Daddy never seemed to be able to keep his hands off you. Your dad was always very affectionate, Molly replied. Jessica snorted, and Angie and Tim smiled. Affectionate is another word for horny? Jessica grinned. Jess! Scolded Molly. The 3 adult children laughed. Gwen fidgeted awkwardly in her seat. Mom, said Jessica, still smiling, I don't understand why you regret showing the man you love how much you wanted him. Sweetheart, I don't regret it. I only regret that the fear of losing him led me to do it. I also wonder what would have happened if I hadn't done it. Would Joe have waited for me? Would he have gone back to Gwen? Whatever happened, I would have hoped he was happy. I know I was more than happy with our life together. Molly, Tim said softly, Dad always said you and Jess saved him. Molly nodded and laughed softly. I know that's true, she said warmly, but he actually saved us too. After my ex left, I had some serious trust issues. I went on dates over and over again for almost 10 years, but those issues kept getting in my way. I had a hard time believing that a man needed me for more than just sex. And then Joe dispelled those misconceptions. Well, Jess grinned, looking at her smirking stepsister. What? Molly asked, confusion written all over her face. Of course Daddy wanted more from you than just sex. Of course he did, honey. Oh my God. Tim, Angie and Jess laughed as they watched Molly's face turn bright red again. "Jessica Patterson, behave yourself," she replied, holding back a shy smile. "Your father's love was so much more than just that. He's a good man and a wonderful father. Even when he first got sick, he still took care of us. I couldn't have prayed for a better, more loving husband. He has made the last 8 years happier than I could have ever imagined." "I never thought Joe seriously considered reconciling with me," Gwen said quietly. "I wondered who he would talk to about something so personal." "Well, since today is apparently Jerry Springer's family confession day," Angie said sarcastically, "it was probably me. Dad and I have had several conversations on the subject." "I didn't realize you were so involved in his decisions at the time," Molly said softly. Angie sighed, looked at Jess, then back at Molly. "More than you might guess," Angie replied calmly. "I knew Dad was at a crossroads, whether to live in the past or move forward. He said he was falling in love with you, Molly, and if he didn't break up with you, he might ask you to marry him. He said he still had feelings for Mom. He told me that you can't be married to someone for that long and not have feelings for her." I asked him about those feelings. He said that while before it was almost pure love, now it was a mixture of love and hate, anger and bitterness, fatigue and despair. He was questioning whether to go back and try to deal with these feelings or start over. Naturally, since I was trying to set him up with Molly, I pushed him into it. "You tried to set him up with other women?" Gwen said sadly. "I didn't realize you hated me so much." "Mom, like I said, I don't hate you, but it wasn't about you. It was about Dad. I saw what your cheating had done to him. It almost killed him. He may have looked strong and calm on the outside, but inside, he was bleeding. I stayed with him that summer after you told him about your affair. It was a month after you confessed and all hell broke loose. I can't tell you how many times I went up to his room to check on him and heard him crying. He didn't cry in front of me, but when he was alone in his room, he let the pain come out. I sat quietly outside his door in the hallway and cried with him. Tears filled Gwen's eyes and she shook her head slowly. "I never knew," she said quietly. "I knew I had hurt him, but I never saw any sign of his pain except for his occasional outbursts of anger. That's because he didn't want you to see it. He didn't want you to have the satisfaction of knowing how much you hurt him. I never wanted to hurt him like that. I was selfish and completely focused on what I wanted and needed, but I didn't maliciously try to hurt your father. Whether you did it intentionally or just out of your own stupidity is not that important, Mom. The fact is that you did. So when he was faced with the choice of going back to a wife who cheated on him and poisoned years of good memories, or starting over with a woman who loved him and would never cheat on him, I insisted on the latter. We all know it would have taken months or years of working through trust issues before he could relax and be happy with you again, Mom. So heck yes, I insisted that he start over with Molly. I do feel a little bad for manipulating him, and I feel kind of bad that I had a hand in making sure you two weren't together anymore. But honestly, Mom, it wasn't about you anymore. It was about my father's happiness. And I believed, and I still believe, that he was happier with Molly than going back and trying to get over the nonsense of rebuilding his marriage to you. Angie, I didn't realize you played the role of matchmaker so well, Molly interjected gently. I'm torn between scolding you and hugging you and thanking you. Well, Jessica intervened, she didn't do it entirely on her own. I have my own confession to add to all this. Jess? Molly asked in surprise. Mom, you know I met Angie in college. She was an upperclassman who tutored me my freshman year. We became friends, and it didn't hurt that she had a cute little brother a couple years older than me. She looked at Tim and smiled sadly, then turned back to her mother. I was still living at home, and Angie came to visit me a few times. I could tell she was watching you very closely. When I brought it up with her, she shared her thoughts that you and her father would be the perfect couple. The next year I was going to move to campus, and I was worried about you being alone. I guess that's when we conspired to find a way to get you two together to see if there was any chemistry between you. I met Tim a few times before Angie invited me to spend the weekend at their house. When I first met Dad, Joe, I fell in love with him immediately. Angie snorted with laughter. She fell in love with him almost as fast as you did, Molly, Angie snorted. Bullshit, Jessica snapped back, smiling. I fell in love with him at least a whole week faster than my mother did. It took her that long to pull her head out of her ass and accept the fact that she loved him too. "Jess, tongue!" Molly stated firmly and allowed herself a small smirk. Jessica playfully stuck her tongue out in her mother's direction and smiled innocently. "Anyway, now that I'm hooked, we started planning how to get you two together. Angie came up with the idea of inviting you and me to visit for the weekend. I'm sorry to say that to cover our plan, we used the story that I loved Tim very much and wanted my mom to meet him." Jessica turned to Tim. "I'm sorry, Tim. I guess I never apologized to you for giving the impression that I took us more seriously than I really did. You were a great guy when we were dating, and obviously I was very attracted to you, but you weren't in love with me." "I know," Tim interjected. "I couldn't figure out what was going on at first. I knew I liked you more than you liked me, but that first visit to my house was a surprise. Then when I saw you with your father, I was even more confused. I won't say that a guy's ego doesn't suffer when his girlfriend falls for his father more than him, but after your next visit with your mom, I finally understood everything. Until then, I was afraid I had fallen in love with a girl with serious issues with her own father." "Well," Jessica laughed, "I guess that's true in a way. I don't know many 19-year-olds who change their last name when their mother remarries. Even though we'd never lived under the same roof before, he was more of a father to me than any other man." "Well," Tim grinned, "after seeing your mom and watching your father's reaction to her and you, it became quite obvious. I'd forgotten how long it had been since I'd seen him smile and laugh like that." The silence in the room was filled with both smiles of reminiscence and anxious regret. "Well," Tim said quietly, "since everyone else has confessed to some deep, dark secret, I guess it's my turn." When all eyes turned to him, Tim cleared his throat. "I just wanted to let you know that you'll probably read something in the papers next week that might upset you. And yes, it's true. I am the lost Kardashian sister, and I recently got engaged to Caitlyn Marie Jenner." "Jerk!" snorted Angie. The room filled with sporadic laughter, a stark contrast to the earlier mood. "Just like his father," Gwen and Molly said at the same time. Both women looked at each other in surprise before Tim stepped back into the conversation. "Thank you," he said, smiling warmly. "I couldn't think of a better compliment." The laughter died down, and there was an awkward silence before Gwen stood up gracefully. "Molly," she smiled sadly, "thank you again for letting me come here today. I'm still trying to move on with my life. This meeting was a big step for me. Thank you for letting it happen." "You're welcome, Gwen, and I hope you can move on and live a wonderful life. It was mostly Joe's decision, although we both felt that something good could come out of it. If he didn't feel that way, I wouldn't have agreed. I wouldn't let anyone hurt my husband." "I wish," Gwen whispered, "I wish I could be as passionately devoted." She looked at her son. "Tim, will you take me to the hotel?" He nodded and gathered his things. Gwen looked back at the frail man sleeping on the bed. "Molly, please tell Joe he's in my prayers, as are you and Jessica." "I will, and thank you." Gwen turned and slowly walked out of the room. As soon as she was on the other side of the door, tears streamed down her face and she sobbed softly. She realized that this was the last time she would see the love of her life alive. 2.5 weeks later, Joseph Randall Patterson, 53, passed away. He died in his sleep while at home, surrounded by his loving family. The funeral service was bittersweet. Molly sat between Jessica and Angie in the front row. To the surprise of some in attendance, Gwen also sat in the front row between Angie and Tim. After the service, friends and family expressed their condolences and then left, heading for the family reception. Now all 3 adult children surrounded Molly as she stood outside the limousine. "Molly," Angie said softly, "I want to thank you again. I never thought I'd see Dad smiling again after the divorce, but you and Jess brought it back into his life. You reminded him that he could love again, and there was no doubt that he loved you both." Molly reached out and gently took her hand. "Never forget how much he loved you and Tim. He was always so proud of you both." "We know," Tim said, smiling sadly. "But divorces make them hard on everyone. Even though Angie and I had already left home, their divorce was hard on us. We wanted to be there for Daddy because he was so hurt and angry, but we couldn't be there every day. We are so thankful he found you." Angie and I also want to thank you for the way you treated Mom these past few weeks. You allowed her to say goodbye to Dad and be a part of the celebration of his life today. Not many people would let an ex-spouse do that. Oh, honey, your father and I knew this was important to Angie and you, as well as your mother. It means more than you realize, Angie added softly. When Daddy fell in love with you, he was able to move on with his life, and Mommy never could. I hope the fact that you and Dad let her say goodbye will help her. Molly, not only did you give my dad a new life, but you may have allowed my mom to do the same. Your dad and I love you both so much, Molly started to say, but her voice broke. I love you both. Molly tried to suppress her sobs as she leaned against the limo. Tears began to run down her face. I'm really going to miss him, she sobbed. Tim stepped forward and put his arms around her as she buried her face in his chest and burst into tears. The two young women embraced each other as they watched her grieve the loss of her love. Gradually, she came to her senses, and everyone turned their attention to the lone woman kneeling beside the grave. Ignoring those present, the woman sobbed quietly. She gently stroked the cold marble headstone, whispering words to the man she once called husband. Angie and Tim silently walked over and stood on either side of their mother. Mom, Angie whispered softly, it's time to go.